Can a person possess everything the world offers and still lose what matters most? The aging King David did not call for an army. He did not seek a show of force. Instead, he summoned the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan to a quiet, water-fed depression known as Gihon Spring. The transition of power required no clash of steel, only the precise execution of a royal command. David watched from his chambers as the men prepared, his gaze fixed on the path leading out of Jerusalem. The air near the spring was heavy with moisture, the sound of trickling water providing the only backdrop to this clandestine gathering. Zadok gathered up the oil, those hands steady, while Nathan stood in silence, scanning the horizon for any sign of opposition. They were not merely performing a ritual, they were securing the future of a kingdom. Every movement was calculated, every word spoken in hushed tones to ensure the continuity of the crown. Solomon waited nearby, observing the assembly of the men who would define his reign. The stone foundations of the city stood firm around them, silent witnesses to a shift that would soon echo through the history of the Levant. Quote, "The preparations were complete. The oil was ready. The power of Israel was about to change hands, shifting from the architect of a nation to the builder of an empire." The oil touched the brow of Solomon, and the quiet of the spring vanished. Zadok signaled toward the city, and the first trumpet blasts cut through the humid air, sharp and resonant. It was the sound of a new age, echoing off the limestone cliffs of Jerusalem. From the slopes above, the people heard the call and turned toward the water. A collective intake of breath swept through the gathering, followed by a surge of movement. They pushed forward, pressing toward the source of the sound, their faces fixed on the man who now held the authority of the throne. Then, the silence shattered. A single shout rose from the front ranks, followed by a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. "Long live King Solomon!" The cry rippled outward, growing in intensity as it reached the city walls. Men raised their hands, and the sound of the trumpet returned, deeper now, layering over the cheers of the crowd. There was no hesitation, no doubt in their voices. They were witnessing a pivot point in history. The transition was complete, the mandate sealed by the voice of the people, and the weight of the crown settled firmly upon the new king as he looked out across the unified kingdom. The echoes of the coronation faded, leaving behind the stark reality of a kingdom that needed to be built. History is rarely just the words written on a scroll. Deep beneath the modern surface of Jerusalem, the earth holds a different record. Archaeologists at the City of David site have cleared away centuries of debris to reveal what lies beneath the dust. They found the terraced foundations, massive stones cut and fitted with precision, confirming the rapid expansion of the city during the 10th century BC. These walls were not built for a small village. They were engineered for a burgeoning empire. Each layer of rock tells a story of mobilization, of labor organized on a scale that matches the biblical accounts of the era. The soil itself bears the weight of the transition. As researchers brush away the dirt, the alignment of the stone structures emerges, matching the defensive needs of a central administration. This is where the narrative meets the ground. The physical footprint of Solomon's Jerusalem is not a myth. It is a series of interconnected platforms and casemate walls that define the Iron Age II period. Every stone placed in those terraces served a purpose, grounding the legacy of the new king in the immovable, tangible evidence of a city rising to dominate the region. The heavy work of administration required a pause. Solomon left the stone terraces and the clamor of the capital, traveling north to the high place at Gibeon. The air here was thinner, cooler, stripped of the city's dust and the constant pressure of urgent petitions. He moved away from the courtiers, the scribes, and the endless demands of a kingdom in its infancy. In the quiet of the night, he sought the sanctuary of the altar. He lay down upon the stone, the hardness of the ground pressing against his back, and watched the stars wheel slowly above the horizon. The world of men felt distant, almost non-existent. Silence reclaimed the landscape, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of his own breathing. He closed his eyes, letting the fatigue of the journey pull him into a deep, unyielding stillness. It was not merely sleep. It was a withdrawal from the self. As his consciousness flickered and dimmed, the darkness of the room began to shift. The space around him seemed to expand, stretching into a vast, luminous expanse that held no walls. He was no longer a king in a tent. He was a presence standing on the edge of something far greater. A sense of absolute clarity descended, and in the center of the void, The encounter began. The voice did not thunder. It resonated with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty hall. The choice was placed before him, absolute and unconstrained. He could have requested the strength to crush every rival, the gold to buy every loyalty, or the longevity to see his works outlast the mountains. He stood in the dream, the weight of a nation resting on his shoulders. He felt the pull of those hungers, the easy allure of absolute control. But he looked past the immediate, past the borders of his own influence. He pictured the faces of those who had come to his court for justice, the people whose lives depended on the accuracy of his discernment. He spoke, not with the arrogance of a ruler, but with the caution of a servant. He asked for an understanding heart, for the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, and the capacity to govern with fairness. The dream held its breath. This request was a rejection of self-interest. It was a pivot point. By choosing the tools of justice over the tools of dominance, he moved from a man seeking to hold power to a man tasked with stewardship. The vision began to recede, but the weight of the request remained, settled firmly into his resolve as he prepared to wake. The dream faded, leaving only the cold reality of the palace throne. Solomon sat upon the dais, his gaze fixed on the heavy cedar doors. The guards pushed them open, and the silence of the court was instantly shattered. Two women shoved their way through the throng of petitioners, their movements jagged and frantic. They did not bow. They did not wait for the heralds. They reached the center of the floor, their hands locked in a violent, desperate grip over a bundle of cloth. One woman lunged forward, her voice cracking against the stone walls. "He is mine!" she screamed, pulling the bundle toward her. The other woman anchored her feet into the dust, yanking back with equal intensity, her eyes wide with a mixture of grief and fury. The court fell into a sudden, suffocating hush. The guards stepped forward, swords half drawn, but Solomon raised a hand. He watched the tremor in their fingers, the sweat on their brows, and the raw, unpolished desperation that defined their struggle. It was a case that defied the archives. There were no witnesses, no property lines, no precedent. The fate of a single life hung in the balance of their conflicting testimonies. Solomon leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the weight of the claim. The accusations collided in the air, a frantic rhythm of claims and counterclaims that refused to settle. Each woman spoke over the other, their voices rising in pitch as they vied for the king's attention. One pointed a trembling finger at the bundle, the other clutched it tighter to her chest, her knuckles white against the fabric. The court began to shift. Spectators leaned over the railings, their murmurs growing into a low, restless hum that echoed off the high stone ceilings. Soldiers gripped their spears, eyes darting between the brawling women and the silent figure on the throne. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust and the metallic tang of fear. Solomon watched, his expression unreadable, his hands resting flat against the armrests of his seat. He let the chaos peak. He let the weight of their desperation fill the hall until it seemed as if the very walls were vibrating with the conflict. Then he stood. The motion was sudden, fluid, and final. He raised his right hand, palm out, and the room went dead. Every whisper ceased. Every guard froze. In the absolute vacuum of that silence, he looked down at the women, a gaze, cold and calculating, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Solomon did not look at the crowd. He looked only at the guard standing to his left. His voice, stripped of all warmth, cut through the stillness like a blade. "Bring me a sword." The command was so dissonant, so detached from the mercy expected of a judge, that the room seemed to tilt. A soldier hesitated, then pulled his steel from its sheath. The rasp of metal against leather sounded like a scream in the quiet hall. Solomon pointed to the bundle on the stone floor. "Divide the living child in two," he said. "Give half to the one and half to the other." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators, a sharp intake of breath that died instantly in their throats. The soldier stepped forward, the point of the sword hovering over the fabric. The sunlight caught the edge of the blade, casting a long, jagged shadow across the mothers. One woman crumbled, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a wail. The other stood frozen, her eyes tracking the steel with a hollow, wide-eyed stare. The air turned frigid. The threat was not a bluff. It was a physical weight pressing down on every person present, forcing a choice between a gruesome end and the truth, The blade remained poised, a sliver of cold light above the bundled cloth. The woman who had claimed the child as her own watched the steel descend, her face hardening into a mask of cruel resolve. She did not blink, but the other woman collapsed. She lunged forward, throwing herself between the soldier and the infant, her hands outstretched in a frantic shielding arc. "No!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the hall. "Give it to her, my lord. Do not kill him. Let her have the child. Just let him live." The tension in the room snapped. The soldier paused, his arm trembling under the weight of the steel. Solomon leaned forward, his gaze shifting from the woman who demanded the division to the one who had just traded her rights for a life. He did not need to deliberate further. He pointed at the mother kneeling on the stone, her shoulders shaking with raw, unchecked relief. "Give the living child to her," he commanded, his voice resonant and clear. "She is the mother." The soldier sheathed his blade with a sharp click. The hall exhaled. What had begun as a test of law had ended as a revelation of the heart, proving that true wisdom was not merely the ability to rule, but the power to discern the depth of human love. The courtroom emptied, but Solomon remained. He moved to the inner chamber, where maps of the 12 tribes lay spread across a cedar table. The era of settling disputes was giving way to the era of building a state. He traced the trade routes with a steady finger, marking the junctions where taxes could be collected and order maintained. A kingdom of this size could not be governed by personal presence alone. It required a network of walls, gates, and storehouses. He picked up a stylus and sketched the layout of a 6-chambered gate, a design meant to control the flow of men and goods. His scribes waited in the shadows, quills poised, as he dictated the quotas for regional governors. The shift was absolute. He was no longer just a judge of individuals, but the architect of an Iron Age power. He stood over the plans, calculating the stone needed for the fortifications at Megiddo and the labor required to link the northern reaches to the capital. Every mountain pass and valley floor became a piece of a larger machine. He did not look for applause. He looked for efficiency. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the blueprint for a centralized administration was etched into the clay. The kingdom was no longer a collection of tribes, but a single, fortified entity. The state blueprints were complete, but the mountains of Israel lacked the timber to realize them. Solomon stood at the palace balcony, looking north toward the peaks of Lebanon. Local forests provided scrub and stone, but not the massive, straight-grained cedar required for the grand structures he envisioned. He summoned his couriers. "Go to Tyre," he commanded, handing them a scroll sealed in wax. "Tell King Hiram that the time for building has come." The journey to the coast was arduous, crossing terrain that tested the resolve of his messengers. They returned weeks later with the terms of a historic pact. Phoenician master builders would supervise the harvest, while Israel would provide the grain, wine, and oil to fuel the coastal cities. It was a calculated exchange of resources for expertise. Solomon watched as the first shipments of cedar arrived at the southern ports, the scent of fresh resin filling the air. He walked among the logs, measuring the diameter of the trunks, knowing these beams would become the structural heart of his capital. The alliance transformed his architectural ambition into a tangible reality. He had moved beyond the borders of his own land to secure the materials necessary for his legacy. The partnership established a new era of cooperation, signaling to the surrounding nations that Israel was an emerging power capable of engaging in the complex trade of the ancient world. The leveling of the bedrock on Mount Moriah began at dawn. Solomon moved through the site, watching as hundreds of laborers cleared the debris. Phoenician architects stood at the edge of the pit, gesturing with charcoal-marked scrolls, while Israelite overseers checked the measurements against the temple floor plan. A sudden dispute broke out near the north perimeter. The local stonecutters struggled to match the precise, interlocking joints required for the foundation, their tools blunt against the limestone. Solomon stepped into the dust, his hands dirt-stained, and signaled for silence. He placed a hand on the unfinished wall, feeling the uneven surface, then pointed to the specific alignment requested by the foreign masters. The workers recalibrated their chisels. With the friction resolved, the rhythm of the site returned a steady, percussive sound of iron striking rock. They were no longer just assembling stones. They were fusing two worlds into a singular design. As the first massive blocks were hoisted into place, the scale of the project became undeniable. The foundation trench grew deep, Carving a permanent footprint into the mountain, Solomon watched the mortar set, his gaze fixed on the rising perimeter. The centerpiece of his era was no longer a dream on a scroll, but a physical reality rising from the earth. The skeleton of the structure stood tall against the skyline, yet the true transformation happened within. Solomon oversaw the arrival of the gold, shipped in heavy crates from distant southern mines. Craftsmen began the meticulous process of overlaying the cedar walls with hammered sheets of the precious metal. The air inside the sanctuary grew thick with the smell of cedar resin and the metallic tang of gold. A complication emerged when the heat of the day threatened to warp the thin metal panels before they could be anchored. Solomon ordered the workers to adjust the tensioning bronze pins, securing the gold directly to the wood grain with microscopic precision. Every surface became a mirror, reflecting the flickering torches and the focused faces of the builders. The chaotic noise of the construction site faded, replaced by the rhythmic tap of mallets on soft metal. Light bounced from floor to ceiling, turning the inner chambers into a vessel of brilliant intensity. This was no longer just a building. It was an exercise in absolute order, where every material served the singular purpose of honoring the divine. Solomon walked the length of the hall, his boots silent on the stone floor, witnessing the convergence of the finest resources of the ancient world into a singular, glowing reality. The vision for the kingdom extended far beyond the walls of the capital. Solomon shifted his attention to the northern frontiers, mapping out a network of defenses essential for a centralized state. He sent engineers to Megiddo and Hazor, demanding a standardized design that could withstand prolonged sieges. The challenge was scale. These outposts were miles apart, requiring consistent masonry and defensive logic. Excavations today reveal the result of that effort. 6-chambered gates stand at the heart of these ruins, a distinct engineering signature that allowed for rapid troop deployment and controlled entry. The casemate walls, double-layered and filled with crushed stone, provided a rigid barrier against encroaching threats. Solomon utilized these projects to bind the provinces to the throne, turning remote outposts into pillars of administrative stability. His overseers enforced strict quality control, ensuring the limestone blocks were cut to uniform dimensions across the entire northern corridor. This was not merely construction. It was the physical manifestation of a unified state. The ruins remain as silent evidence of a sprawling infrastructure, proving that the reach of the kingdom was as calculated as its architecture. Where once there were disparate tribes, these fortifications created a cohesive, defensible whole, anchoring the kingdom into the landscape of the Iron Age. The massive project reached its end. Solomon stood before the bronze altar, his back to the gathered crowds. He raised both hands, signaling for the final silence. The air in the courtyard held a heavy, electric stillness. Thousands of people watched as the last gate was pushed open. There was no sound of wind, no movement of birds. Then, the transformation began. A dense white light rolled through the entrance, spilling over the threshold and flooding the inner sanctuary. It was not fire, but a presence that occupied every corner of the structure. The priests who had been arranging the offerings dropped their vessels and retreated in haste, unable to stand under the weight of the phenomenon. Solomon remained, his figure silhouetted against the blinding radiance. The glory of the Lord filled the house, turning the stone walls into something translucent and unreachable. This was the peak of the reign. The architecture, the trade, and the law all converged into this singular moment of divine acceptance. The kingdom held its breath. The silence was absolute. In that light, the boundary between the mortal world and the divine vanished, leaving only the reality of the promise fulfilled. Solomon watched as the brightness settled into the very stones of the foundation, marking the house as something beyond human making. The fame of the kingdom traveled faster than any messenger. It followed the ancient trade route south into the Arabian Peninsula. The fame of the kingdom traveled faster than any messenger. It followed the ancient trade route south into the Arabian Peninsula, carrying tales of a king whose wisdom was matched only by the scale of his construction. Gold flowed inward, and the scent of frankincense and myrrh became the signature of the Jerusalem markets. But the most significant arrival came from the south. The horizon began to shimmer with a long, slow-moving line of dust. It was not a merchant party, but a royal procession. Hundreds of camels navigated the rugged pass, their burdens shifting with the rhythmic sway of the trek. They carried spices in quantities never seen in the Levant, along with chests of gold and precious stones that caught the harsh desert light. The guards at the city gates stood aside as the massive caravan slowed. At the center of the line, a figure emerged from the heat haze. The Queen of Sheba had arrived, her presence signaling that the kingdom had become the nexus of the ancient world. She stopped her mount before the threshold of the capital, looked up at the towering limestone walls, and waited. The balance of influence had shifted. The world had come to see if the rumors of Solomon's reign were true. The palace interior was cool and silent compared to the desert heat outside. Sheba moved across the polished floor, her eyes scanning the room, seeking a weakness in the man who claimed to hold the wisdom of heaven. She did not wait for formalities. She began her interrogation, weaving complex scenarios of law, ethics, and nature. Each question layered with a trap intended to catch a mind less refined than his own. Solomon listened, his posture still, his gaze fixed on her. He did not rush. He unpacked each riddle, tracing the logic back to its core, exposing the hidden contradictions with calm, measured sentences. He spoke of the balance of seasons, the structure of justice, and the unseen threads connecting all things. Sheba watched him, her questions growing more pointed, more difficult. Yet he met every challenge without hesitation. With each response, the air in the room seemed to sharpen. She searched for a flicker of doubt or a pause of uncertainty in his expression, but found only steady confidence. Finally, she stopped. She leaned against a stone pillar, the tension draining from her shoulders. Her initial skepticism vanished, replaced by a profound recognition. She had come to test a myth, only to find the reality far more formidable than the rumors suggested. The departure of the foreign caravan left the palace in a state of quiet reflection, yet the machinery of the kingdom never slowed. Solomon turned his attention to the heart of his administration, where the accumulation of wealth had reached a scale that altered the landscape of the region. At the center of the Great Hall, he commissioned a throne that would serve as the singular focal point of his authority. It was a massive work of engineering, constructed from solid ivory and overlaid with plates of beaten gold. Lions carved from wood stood as guardians at the base, 6 steps leading up to the seat, each flanked by further figures of strength. The craftsmanship drew from the finest techniques of the age, blending local tradition with the refined methods of distant artisans. When the morning light struck the chamber, the gold reflected a brilliance that seemed to fill the entire structure, turning the hall into a beacon of stability. It was not merely a seat of governance. It was a physical manifestation of a kingdom at the height of its influence. Every merchant, every diplomat, and every official who entered the room stopped at the threshold to witness the scale of this achievement. In this space, the concept of prosperity ceased to be an abstract idea and became a tangible, heavy reality that defined the era. The heavy silence of the Great Hall began to change. Where once there was only the singular authority of the king, the corridors now echoed with the sounds of unfamiliar tongues and the presence of new envoys. Solomon welcomed women from far-flung territories, each bringing the rituals and customs of their own lands into the very center of his administration. In the courtyard, the patterns of daily life shifted. Foreign attendants moved with their own distinct rhythms, and the incense burned in the inner chambers began to carry scents unknown to the local priests. Solomon watched these developments, not with concern, but with a growing curiosity that drew him away from the long-standing traditions of his office. He granted space for their practices, allowing altars to rise in the vicinity of the city. The palace, once a bastion of unified purpose, became a crossroads of competing loyalties. As the new influences took root, the internal cohesion of the court began to fracture. Decisions were no longer made in isolation. They were filtered through the diverse perspectives of his expanding household. The king remained at the center, yet his focus was visibly split, caught between the demands of his legacy and the pull of these new, foreign voices that now occupied his private life. The king sat alone in his private chambers, the silence of the room now heavy with a different kind of pressure. He found himself lingering in spaces where the old prayers no longer resonated with the same clarity. The focus that once guided his every decree began to scatter, pulled toward the rituals of his new household. He stopped visiting the inner sanctuary of the temple at the appointed hours, his mind occupied by the intricacies of foreign traditions that had taken hold in his court. The internal tether that had once anchored him to a singular purpose felt thin, frayed by the constant exposure to competing beliefs. He did not issue a command to abandon the past. but his actions reflected a quiet, steady retreat from the exclusive devotion that defined his early reign. In the quiet hours before dawn, he watched the city from his balcony, realizing that the foundation he had built was shifting beneath him. He was no longer the architect of a unified vision, but a man divided by his own choices. The spiritual center of the kingdom began to tilt, and for the first time, the king felt the weight of a silence that was not peace, but the absence of his former resolve. The transformation of the landscape began on the ridges overlooking the city. Stone by stone, laborers hauled materials to the high places, erecting platforms that defied the singular focus of the temple below. These sites rose rapidly, their shapes distinct and foreign against the skyline of Jerusalem. Solomon watched from the palace walls as the projects reached completion, the structures gleaming in the sun. Each altar served a different deity, housing rituals that had no place within the original vision of the kingdom. The people walked the streets and looked up to see these new silhouettes carved into the hillsides. The unity of the capital fractured. Where once the gaze of the nation was directed toward the central sanctuary, it was now pulled in multiple directions by the presence of these competing shrines. Incense smoke drifted from the ridges, mingling with the air, and signaling a public abandonment of the monotheistic standards that had defined the era. The construction was not merely a matter of architecture. It was a visible rejection of the covenant. By allowing these high places to dominate the horizon, the king fundamentally altered the character of his realm, turning the city into a fragmented landscape of conflicting loyalties. The news of the king's concessions traveled faster than the smoke from the new altars. In the markets, the usual commerce faltered. Merchants who once touted the prosperity of the realm now kept their heads low, trading only in whispers. The elders of the city gathered in the shadowed corners of the gates, their faces set in hard, unyielding lines. When the king traveled through the streets, the expected cheers did not materialize. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence greeted his passage. He looked out from his carriage, but the people turned their backs, their movements deliberate and final. The air in Jerusalem grew thick with the unspoken recognition of a broken covenant. Tension vibrated in the very stone of the walls, a tremor of dissent that no decree could silence. The unity of the tribe began to dissolve into factions, each family choosing sides as the king retreated further into his own isolation. On the horizon, the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with the mounting weight of a coming storm. The infrastructure of the kingdom remained, but the soul of the nation had already begun to splinter. Every brick laid in the capital now felt like a marker of a kingdom waiting for its inevitable collapse. The palace gates stood open, yet no one dared enter. Then, the rhythm of the city changed. A man walked through the center of the thoroughfare, his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the royal residence. The guards at the threshold moved to intercept him, but he did not slow. He carried no weapon, only the weight of an unyielding presence that stopped the guards in their tracks. He reached the courtyard where the king's attendants stood in a loose circle. The prophet Ahijah did not wait for an invitation. He stepped into the light, his shadow falling across the stone floor of the inner sanctum. The ambient noise of the palace vanished, replaced by the sound of his breathing. He stood before the king, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the opulent surroundings with cold precision. The air between them sharpened, the temperature seeming to drop in the sudden stillness. Ahijah raised his hand, his fingers pointing toward the walls that held the record of the king's decisions. He spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. "The foundations you have laid are built on sand. The unity of this house is finished. The God of Israel has seen the altars on the hills, and the covenant is broken." The warning echoed off the stone, a final, irrevocable indictment. The king stood motionless, his eyes locked on the prophet. Ahijah did not blink. He reached up, grasping the heavy fabric of his own mantle with both hands. His knuckles whitened under the strain. He pulled. The sound of rending fibers echoed through the chamber like a whip crack. He did not stop at one tiert. He ripped the fabric again, and again, and again. 12 distinct pieces of cloth fell to the hard floor, landing in a scattered circle at the king's feet. Each piece was a jagged, undeniable representation of a tribe. Ahijah stood amidst the ruins of his own work, his chest rising and falling with the exertion. He gestured to the remnants on the stone. "So shall the kingdom be divided," he stated, his voice devoid of doubt. The weight of his words settled into the room, more permanent than the gold-leafed walls surrounding them. The king looked down at the shredded material, his gaze tracing the lines of the split fabric. The message was clear. The unity of the realm had ceased to exist. The air in the palace felt suddenly thin, as if the very structure of the building were groaning under the pressure of the coming collapse. Ahijah turned, his footsteps striking the floor with a rhythmic, final cadence as he walked toward the exit, leaving the torn remnants of his warning behind. The king did not call for his guards. He remained in the center of the hall, staring at the scattered cloth. Outside the chamber, the news moved faster than a runner. It traveled through the barracks, into the market, and reached the ears of the regional governors. The confidence that had once defined the administration began to fray. In the corridors, advisors stopped speaking when the king approached. They drifted into corners, their voices dropping to urgent, low-pitched exchanges. The unity of the court was failing. Soldiers at the gates exchanged glances, their loyalty no longer anchored to a singular, unquestioned command. They shifted their weight, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of dissent. The king walked through the grand halls, but the architecture no longer felt like a monument to his reign. It felt like a shell. He observed the servants packing their belongings in the servants' quarters. He heard the muffled arguments of tax collectors debating who they truly served. The prophecy was no longer a spoken threat. It was a physical movement within the city walls. The foundation of the kingdom was shifting under the pressure of doubt. Every stone in the palace seemed to loosen as the people began to align themselves against the center, choosing sides in a conflict that had not yet erupted but was already consuming the heart of the nation. The first open act of defiance came at the northern gate. Messengers arrived, not with tribute, but with demands for independence. They did not bow. They stood in the dust, their hands resting on the hilts of their blades, waiting for a response that never came. The king watched from the high battlements as the caravans turned away from the capital, redirecting their trade to regional strongholds. The flow of gold and grain stopped. The central administration was starving. In the streets below, the silence of the markets was replaced by the rising clamor of tribal leaders declaring their own laws. Stone by stone, the infrastructure of the Golden Age was being dismantled by those who once served it. The king descended to the courtyard, but the guards did not turn to face him as he passed. They stared at the horizon, their focus shifted toward their own ancestral lands. A sudden tremor shook the ground, a minor shifting of the earth, yet it felt like the final settling of a collapsing structure. The kingdom was no longer a single entity. It was a collection of fractured pieces, each drifting further from the center. The king stood alone in the vast, echoing space of his own creation, listening to the sound of a nation tearing itself apart. The final reports arrived in silence. One by one, the regional governors had ceased their correspondence, closing their borders and pulling their garrisons back to ancestral territories. The administrative machinery that had once linked the edges of the land to the capital had ceased. Maps in the central archive sat gathering dust, depicting a kingdom that no longer existed in reality. The king walked the length of the grand hall, his boots echoing against stones that once held the weight of a unified people. Now, they served only to mark the distance between his isolation and the reality of the fractured provinces. He reached for a scroll on the table, but the ink had faded and the seal was broken. Outside, the city of Jerusalem remained, but its reach had withered. Trade routes were redirected by local lords, and the gold that once flowed through the gates had vanished. The unity of the monarchy had been the singular achievement of his reign, and now, he watched it dissolve into a mosaic of competing fiefdoms. There were no more decrees to issue, no more borders to defend, and no more central authority to command. The Golden Age had reached its definitive end, leaving behind only the cold, silent stone of a legacy that had outlived its own foundations. The king sat at his desk, the room heavy with the smell of old parchment and cooling oil. Before him lay the records of his life, the inventories of gold, the lists of conquered territories, and the blueprints of the Great Temple. He picked up a quill, the tip scratching sharply against the surface of a fresh scroll. He began to write, not of his achievements, but of the emptiness that followed them. He had mastered the trade routes, stacked his vaults with cedar and ivory, and commanded the labor of thousands. Yet the silence in the room was absolute. He dipped the quill again, his hand steady, and set the words down. All is vanity. The ink bloomed into the fibers of the paper. He looked at the vast, silent treasures surrounding him, now mere objects in a room that felt smaller by the hour. Wealth had been his primary instrument, but it had not anchored his reign against the tide of time. He pushed the scroll aside. The golden vessels on the table caught the dim light, offering no warmth. He recognized then that success, when stripped of its connection to a higher purpose, was nothing more than a weight upon the spirit. The pursuit had been absolute, yet the result was a hollow echo of the very glory he had sought to build. The king turned back to the records of his later years. These pages detailed the construction of shrines for foreign deities, a project he had once authorized to maintain diplomatic stability. He traced the lines of the ink with a calloused finger. What had begun as a strategy for peace had evolved into a quiet abandonment of his core convictions. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. He saw the high places he had permitted, distinct and visible against the skyline. These structures were not mere stone. They were the physical markers of a heart divided. He had believed his wisdom was a shield, an impenetrable armor against the influence of his own desires. Yet, the evidence proved otherwise. Every concession had been a choice, and every choice had narrowed the distance between his early vision and his current fragmentation. He reached out to close the heavy wooden shutters, blocking the view of the city. The room plunged into shadow. The wisdom that had defined his youth had not failed him. He had failed the wisdom. He sat in the dark, confronting the reality that the greatest threat to his legacy was not the shifting of empires or the depletion of gold, but the subtle, persistent erosion of his own integrity. Time has stripped away the gold, the ivory, and the cedar, leaving only the bedrock of Jerusalem. Today, researchers walk the dust of the Ophel, tracing the lines of casemate walls that once defined a kingdom. These limestone foundations remain embedded in the earth, forming the skeletal structure of a city that outlasted its architect. We look upon these jagged ruins and see the physical evidence of monumental intent. The six-chambered gates still stand where they were set 3 millennia ago, enduring long after the political influence they were built to project. They are silent observers, holding the space where the glory of the temple once dominated the horizon. There is no vanity in these stones. They offer a precise, unyielding record. They document the scale of the infrastructure and the limits of the ambition that raised it. To stand among these remnants is to engage with the reality of a life that reached for everything, and yet could not secure the integrity of its own foundations. The ruins do not speak of triumph, but of the cost. They remain in the light of the modern sun, providing a permanent, tangible warning of what happens when the structures of success become disconnected from the core convictions that first gave them meaning. Solomon gained wisdom, wealth, and power beyond imagination. Yet his story remains a warning that success alone cannot guarantee a lasting legacy. God is the only lasting foundation in our lives.